Welcome, everyone, to our expert interview series as part of our End Rape campaign. I'm Dr. Caroline Helpman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Representation Project. If you're not familiar with the REP Project, we are an organization founded by Jennifer Siebel Newsom back in a decade ago after her film Misrepresentation launched a national conversation around sexism in media, and we have been working hard using film and activism and campaigns to raise awareness about rigid gender roles and norms, including those that lead to sexual violence. Quickly want to make sure that you know that this will be a triggering or activating conversation. The topics will revolve around sexual violence, so please know that. And if you're not in a good place where maybe watching it live might be a challenge, perhaps you should watch it recorded. I am honored today to interview Kenyora Lenair Parham, and she is the current executive director of End Rape on Campus, or EROC, a national initiative that works to end campus sexual violence by providing support for survivors and their communities. They also work on prevention through education and policy reform from the campus level up to the federal level. So an all-purpose organization tackling sexual violence at a systemic, individual, all the levels. So prior to leading the charge at EROC, Kenyora served for the past decade working with youth and families, college students and administrators, also working with community and government leaders, including the late Mayor Thomas Menino of Boston, Massachusetts, and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. Kenyora has worked for several nonprofit organizations and higher education institutions, including Brandeis, Strong Women, Strong Girls, and Simmons University. Kenyora is an active advisory board member of the Every Voice Coalition and Culture of Respect, and she co-founded Students Rise International, an organization that you should definitely check out if you're not familiar with their work. And in 2016, Kenyora was recognized as a finalist for the Extraordinary Women Campaign led by the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement in Boston, Massachusetts. And in 2021, she was named a, quote, leader on fire by Ignite National during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. She's also a proud alum of Girls Incorporated of Lynn, Massachusetts, and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. She is a 2023 Rodenbury Foundation Fellow. And welcome to you, Kenyora. It is so wonderful to be having a conversation with you today.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's start off with the question that I know a lot of folks want to know about your journey and about your path. We'll get into the work of EROC and your work fighting sexual violence in other ways. But tell us about your life path to using politics, policy, to using nonprofit leadership to fight against sexual violence. When did you know this would be your path? What are some of the big milestones along the way?
Absolutely. For me, I like to share my story by saying that I've been raised in a very maternal household, being surrounded by and participating in women-centered spaces. So I'm a proud Simmons alumna, which is a women-centered university, class of 2010, if anyone's in the house. I'm a lifelong learner of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and of course that Girls Inc. of Lynn alum. My path to nonprofit leadership and activism wasn't actually something I was seeking out for. In fact, I actually wanted to be an architectural engineer and an interior designer, and wanted to create really funky, cool spaces that invoked inspiration, motivation, and empowerment for women and girls, and especially those who are at the intersections of their identities, who are often subjected to being placed in categories or marginalized for who they are. And so if you recall spaces like The Wing, which is like a women-focused co-working space, like it was spaces like that I really wanted to create, where you can simply just be yourself. But, you know, for me, my life took a different path. And, you know, particularly at Simmons, where I ultimately decided to go, I was an active student leader there. I was president for 2 years, both my junior and senior year, as president of the Black Student Organization, where I really took active stances against racism, xenophobia, homophobia, like all of the isms you can think of. Because for Simmons, we were proud in the fact that the Black Student Organization was founded during the Civil Rights Movement, where students really took an active role in determining, demanding essentially the college at the time before it became a university, to take account of the welfare of its Black and Brown and Latino students, and to create spaces and courses and hire faculty of color that really represent the students there. And it was at Simmons where I was able to meet Ayanna Presley in her former capacity as the Boston City Councilor. But then as we move and progress into my career, especially, I knew I wanted to work with women and girls who looked like me, who were at the intersection of their identities. And I actually literally dreamed my job, which was Strong Women, Strong Girls at the time, located in Boston. And SWSG essentially is a multi-generational organization that had college women serving as mentors for elementary school girls, and those college women were being mentored by professional women. And so I had the opportunity to work with the founder of SWSG, work alongside the board on various different projects. So I learned pretty much like the ins and outs of nonprofit, and was there for about 5 years, and then transitioned to Brandeis University as an assistant director of pre-college programs, where I ran 4 summer residential programs for high school students, providing them with the opportunity to engage in community building and college level coursework. And then my activism really stems from not only in terms of what I've experienced at Simmons, but also within my professional career. I've experienced a lot of organizational trauma and, in my professional career, where majority of folks that I've had have been white women who served as supervisors for me. Some of them who uplifted me and still to this day are in my corner. And then some folks who really held a lot of biases. It wasn't until I got to Brandeis where I learned about the term gaslighting and things of that nature. And so I try to take everything that I've learned from them, even the good, the bad, and the ugly, and move in a way that in my next opportunity, which was EROC, to really create the spaces that where I felt seen, heard, and believed ultimately. And so I took that energy of what not to do and made sure that I engaged in as myriad as possible in professional development workshops and trainings as I could. But I also too am a survivor myself, but that has never been something that I used as part of my career trajectory, but it's always something that's just sunk in the back of my head. I've had a number of folks who within my family or friends who are also survivors. And so sometimes I like to think, with everything that I've experienced in my professional capacity, everything that I've known from the people I'm surrounded by, I essentially landed at Henry Von campus through serendipity, where I can then create, instead of buildings, what I wanted to do as an architectural engineer, I now can create a whole different type of space that really focuses on those women and girls, those at the intersections of their identities, and really, create something that allows them to walk in their truth, with courage to love themselves and others.
Thank you. That is a great segue into talking about EROC, right? About the epidemic of sexual violence on college campuses and how EROC is addressing that. Can you speak about the work of the organization that you're leading?
Yeah, absolutely. So Henry on Campus was founded back in 2013 by then students Annie Clark and Andrea Pino Silva, who both attended the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then Sophie Karasek, who attended at the time University of California, Berkeley. And they had actually was able to connect after they experienced their own harrowing experiences of campus sexual assault, interpersonal violence, and subsequent dismissal responses from their respective universities. And what they recognized is that there was a gap of knowledge and understanding under Title IX and how Title IX could be used as a vehicle to seek justice. And so they traveled across the country, meeting with different students and essentially educating students on their rights under Title IX, and hosting press conferences that would put schools on notice and kind of on blast, if you will, about what they're not doing in support of students that attend there and who have experienced campus sexual assault, as a way of helping them, really identify the schools that are not being as transparent as they should be and not taking accountability for the welfare of their students. So over time, we've done so much in terms of equipping over 100,000 students from across the United States. We've testified in various states, and we're still doing a lot of policy reform, especially as it pertains to Title IX and the current limbo we're under. We're trying to reintroduce new laws that help shift the culture on campuses, but more specifically, we're trying to help student survivors of sexual assault really band together and support one another to shift that culture from one to safety and respect. And our goal for the long term has always been around that transparency and accountability on campuses. And so we know that with Title IX, navigating through that process has often been one that is daunting. We have student survivors who are often ignored, they're dismissed, they're shamed, they're not believed. Everything's typically swept under the rug. And so up until this point, after meeting with different student survivors and their families and parents, what we've come to recognize is that there is no standardized system where students and their families can access and compare sexual assault statistics and information on how to report if a student chooses to do so, and as well as what type of survivor support resources are available on campuses. And so what we've recognized is that information is essentially scattered across various federal databases, college and university websites, and it's often been difficult for students to know what resources are available to them. And so we are actually trying to meet this moment and have met this moment where we launched the first ever of its kind, our campus accountability mapping tool. And that mapping tool really is a compilation of information where students who are seeking to understand what type of sexual assault policies of colleges and universities have across the United States, provides them with some in-depth information on each of those institutions, sexual assault investigation policies, the Clery data that they should be reporting to the Clery Center and the Department of Education, prevention efforts, and other like survivor support resources. So we're taking all of that, instead of having students and their families comb through various web pages, we've essentially centralized all of that public information into one space. And so the mapping tool itself has 5 key parameters. So the numerical statistics, policy information, investigation procedures, prevention efforts, and survivor support resources. All completely volunteer-driven effort that took about 3 years in the making to make. And we launched it earlier this year, and we currently have about 1,500 schools and counting on the map. And so our hope is that we'll be able to expand the tool to include most up-to-date colleges and universities, and some other iterations that we would want to include that's really informed by student survivors themselves.
Thank you. Okay, so folks can access this map obviously on your website. I'm curious about, you had brought up intersectionality, right? That you're serving survivors who often are at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities. Can you talk about why that's so important when addressing any survivor population?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially for me, intersectionality has always been key to anything that I do. And so I was so happy when I became a part of NRAP on campus and I became executive director that I can really instill that into our work. And so our mission and our vision is really driven by our Centering the Margins framework. And that Centering the Margins framework was actually initiated by a former staff member a few years ago that really paid particular focus to HBCUs and Black women. But I wanted to utilize that idea and move it into a way that really centralizes what we do and becomes the core of our work. And yes, pays particular attention to Black women in HBCUs, but everyone at the intersections of their identities needed to be uplifted. And so our framework of our CTM really aims to address and fill the disparity of resources between different communities, but it's the intentionality of centering those historically marginalized and systemically marginalized student survivors in this space. Because oftentimes what people tend to think when they think of the perfect victim of sexual assault it's often a cisgender white woman and girls. And while they're greatly impacted by sexual assault, they're not the only ones affected. And so it's important for us to raise awareness and amplify the voices of Black women and girls, boys and men, people of color, especially those who may be a part of the LGBTQIA communities, those who are immigrant, first generation, have disabilities, maybe neurodivergent, whatever their identity is, it's important for them to be represented and their voices to be heard. They're often left out of the national discourse when we're talking about campus sexual assault, sexual violence generally. And while most recently we've been seeing attention being paid to these communities, there are more culturally responsive resources that exist in ways in which these individuals are seen, heard, and believed. It's still not the same extent as their white counterparts. And so it's important for us to uplift their voices because student survivors in their experience are not monolithic. Sexual violence knows no bounds, and it affects everyone no matter what their identity or background is. And so student survivors and those, especially who are coming from marginalized communities, deserve not only deserve, but also have the right to be in violence-free communities and especially have a violence-free education.
Yeah, can you speak a little more about that? I know we brought up Title IX earlier, and a question that sometimes comes up is, well, what is Title IX, right? Equitable education have to do with sexual violence. And of course, that applies to K through 12 and college. Can you speak more about why sexual violence is an educational equity issue because of the ways in which it affects survivors?
So Title IX especially is a federal civil rights law that especially prohibits discrimination based off of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, particularly one that where an educational program or activity is happening. And so we've often seen since 1972 when it was enacted to be something that uplifts and expands women's rights and access towards a myriad of different things that typically males have dominated over the years. So typically when we think about Title IX, a lot of people associate it with sports worlds, right? When in fact, it really is much more deeper and beyond that. It's really just about how is one being able to get an education where they can seek a career that might be male dominated, but they're not being discriminated against because of another identity that they may have, but they have the right and they have the access to engage in whatever career path they so choose. Even when we're thinking about the next step in terms of grad school and maybe wanting to get our PhD, like having the opportunity to dive deep into certain research, methodologies or research topics that aren't necessarily tapped into, but being able to do that without any qualms around access to resources and knowledge. And so it really is about seeking an education because it's about the education itself and it shouldn't be about who you are as an individual.
Absolutely. Thank you. And one of the themes of our expert interview series, Kenyora, is this idea of rape myths and a lot of commonly held beliefs that are simply not accurate. What are some things about sexual violence, whether myths or just things that people don't know much about? What are some things that you wish everyone knew about sexual violence?
So I definitely want to start off with the myths and misconceptions that I wish we would unlearn. And so I'm prepared to share three type of myths that we often hear. One is if a campus proceeding found that an alleged perpetrator not responsible due to the lack of evidence, then no sexual assault took place. That could be far from true. In fact, it's the lack of evidence to prove that a sexual assault took place is different from evidence showing that a sexual assault did not take place. So too often what we see is campuses, when they engage in sexual assault cases, sometimes there is a lack, they lack enough evidence for a school to issue a finding of responsibility. And that with many campus sexual assaults, there are often few witnesses that are willing to come forward, even fewer witnesses who are willing to come forward where there's underage drinking or drug use that's involved. And so without corroborating statements or other physical evidence to prove a sexual assault took place, there just isn't enough evidence for campus officials to find a finding of responsibility. So it doesn't mean that it didn't take place. It's just there wasn't enough evidence to conclude the responsibility to be placed on the perpetrator, which is unfortunate. A second myth I want to share is if a survivor's testimony is inconsistent, then the allegation must be false. Sexual assault, like any other traumatic incident, can lead to fragmented memory, difficulties in recalling the incident. Additionally, there's harmful stereotypes that a real sexual assault always involves a male stranger as the perpetrator, a female victim, the use of violence, and a prompt response to the police. And in fact, a lot of survivors who do not fit this narrative may omit or exaggerate details in hopes of creating more believable case in order to avoid even be blamed for inciting assault. If anything, survivors might also not present a fully accurate report to protect their assailants in cases in which they have a previous relationship or rely on them for financial support. The third myth I want to share is that if a survivor doesn't report to the police, then they must not have been really sexually assaulted. First of all, there are many reasons why a survivor of sexual assault may not choose to report to the police. Engaging with the criminal justice system can re-traumatize survivors. The likelihood of a conviction for a perpetrator is so low that a lot of folks tend not to pursue this option. So there are many reasons for not reporting to the police, are also actually very similar reasons as to why a survivor may withdraw their complaint. For survivors of campus sexual assault, especially, rather than reporting to police or pursuing a criminal conviction against their perpetrators, they may opt out to essentially just report to their university so that they can attend class without fear of seeing their perpetrator. And then when we think about marginalized survivors, especially in this space that face additional barriers to reporting to police, there's that fear of not receiving equal support, justice due to a history of betrayal by police and the court system. And so then you have those existing stereotypes about women of color being hypersexual or promiscuous, which also contributes to fears and not being believed by authorities. And so I think what's really important is that we talk about the underreporting of sexual assaults by survivors, and how that occurs much more frequently than false reporting. And that, false reporting is fueled by misconceptions, of disproportionate media coverage. There's public scrutiny that's also given to false reporting of sexual assault, which actually draws attention away from the actual more serious problem of underreporting. And so, in order to encourage and increase accurate reporting of sexual assault to both universities and law enforcement, we have to combat rape culture. We have to build an environment that is supportive to survivors to be a priority. But the one thing I do wish that, or many things that I do, but what I'll share just in short, is that I want folks to understand that there are various and numerous resources available. So whether a student may live on or off campus, or regardless of whether their school has a violence prevention center or happens to have or not have a Title IX coordinator or some sort of advocacy, there are various organizations out here who are willing to support people, provide them with the tools and resources to navigate through this. So whether it's End Rape on Campus, It's On Us, Know Your Nine, Casa de Esperanza, Me Too, the Trevor Project, like a whole bunch of folks who are out here doing this great work, the National Women's Law Center, Equal Rights Advocates, like I can name so many, just for folks to know that there's a great community of people who are either survivors themselves, advocates, activists who are just willing to shift that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So many great resources, and you're a leader in terms of campus resources. A couple more questions. So folks, if you have questions, make sure you put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, and we will get to your questions. What advice do you have for folks when someone discloses to them about an experience of sexual violence? So how should they be responding? How should they be supporting a survivor?
Yeah, my advice to those for those folks who learn of someone's experience is, if anything, to simply listen and believe first. even if you're unsure of anything, like that doesn't matter. What you're unsure of doesn't matter. The only thing you need to be sure of is that the person who is disclosing receives the care and the support they need to navigate through, and that you follow their lead on what it is that they want to do and how they wish to move forward or not move forward. I think oftentimes people jump to conclusions or jump straight into action because they're like, oh, I want to help you. I want to help you navigate through this, and this shouldn't have happened to you. While that is great, sometimes most people just want to be heard and believed, and then allowed to feel that autonomy to move forward with how they wish. So if anything, listen and believe first.
Yeah, I mean, don't take away in a moment when their consent and their power has been taken away. Don't further do that again, or further that. Really great advice. So last question, and please jump into the Q&A. I see some great questions coming in. In your expert opinion, what do we need to do to effectively address sexual violence? What cultural shifts do we need? What policy mandates? What should we be doing here? If you have a magic wand, what are we doing, Kenyora?
Yeah. Especially in the higher education space, and I would also say in the K through 12, but particularly because we focus on higher ed, institutions have to meet this moment now, not later, now. And they have to take accountability for how they are putting the welfare of their students and their safety first, and providing an environment that prioritizes that. And so if anything, I would say providing support for survivors and focusing on their individual needs is absolutely crucial. Prevention, programming, and education from the very beginning, whether it's especially in the K through 12 space, but in the campus, college and university campus space, not just in terms of orientation, but also ongoing training of what that looks like. And especially when students first arrive, whether they're first years or maybe they're transfer students, it doesn't matter what level, as long as everyone's getting consistent, information. We also need to put forth policies that are survivor centered, that are intersectional. So yes, Title IX has been expanded to be inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. We also have to be put in mind that there are other civil rights laws that should also be uplifted, like Title II, that focuses on the prohibition of discrimination against folks who have disabilities or neurodivergence. Or if you have Title VI, where we're talking about race and nationality and religion. And so, for what I can imagine and what I hope and what we're trying to do here is to, have colleges and universities really incorporate, maintain, and I would say even evaluate how they're going about their prevention strategies and really address that continuum of all levels of sexual assault. And, be respectful of the cultural nuances that play a role, especially because we know sexual assault affects everyone. So it has to be trauma informed, culturally responsive. There are places that also need to, and I would say, invest higher amount of money, really prioritizing their financial resources to be intentional about creating and focusing safety norms on campus. And I would even just say, currently we're working on Title IX, which we're hoping to be released in the fall. But we're also working on another policy that has been in the making for almost a decade now, and that's the Campus Accountability and Safety Act. And so we're hoping to reintroduce that into the fall and really cement how schools go about taking a proactive stance. And then the other policy mandate I would also want to uplift is around the Equal Rights Amendment, and that being further cemented into our Constitution, because if that's done, that will help to supersede a whole bunch of things that we wouldn't have to do, because then women, and especially those at the intersections of their identities, will truly be seen as for who they are and as people within the Constitution. But at the end of the day, it's not enough to say we have like a violence prevention center on our campuses. if you don't have a well-balanced representation of people who look like the students that you're serving, and especially before they become survivors, putting those things in place so folks move forward and have that violence-free education that they so well deserved.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to be looking around, if you see me looking around, for little kittens, for some of our therapy kittens while we jump into the questions. We have a number of really great questions inspired by what the expertise that you have shared, Kenyora. The first, let's go with straightforward one. Are there any colleges or universities that are doing it right, or at least positioning themselves on the forefront of a movement to address the campus rape epidemic?
That is actually a very good question, and I won't be able to officially give what schools or which schools are doing that concretely. But what I will say is that with our campus accountability and map and tool, we are actually looking to figure out ways to evaluate what exactly that looks like.
Mm.
And how to say, like, here's how this school is doing, not better than another school, but here's how a school is doing better for their community itself. And here's how other schools can probably take some advice, if you will, from how the school is doing better. I like to think that there are individual people on college campuses that are doing the great work, but sometimes they're even facing the barriers that help them to even go beyond than what the federal laws will prevail, state laws will prevail, things of that nature. So I would say more to come on that for sure.
Great. Well, and this somewhat along those same lines, it's just a really, tough, like it's difficult to say what we should do, right, with folks on a college campus who have violated social norms, who've engaged in sexual violence. And here's a question, I know, against the backdrop of really pushing for transformational justice, right, for pushing for different types of justice. What kind of response or recommendations do you have for people who've committed harm and admit to it, and how to improve their behavior that is outside the criminal legal system?
That's a tough question. Particularly in that, and I will say I'm not an expert in this side of things when it comes to self-harm or suicide ideation. If anything, I know as folks who experience any type of trauma, whether it's sexual assault or any other type of violence or other type of traumas, is that sometimes it could lead folks to engage in self-harm. And so what I would 100% do is refer them to the hotline or the suicide hotline, who would be able to provide them with those types of resources on where to go. I'm not an expert in how to change or mitigate behaviors, but the one thing I will say is, the number one thing is being there for that person and letting them know that they have you as someone that they can turn to, that they're not alone. And you yourself can also reach out to some of these hotlines to even figure out what's the best way that I should be approaching this person who's just disclosed to me that they're thinking about self-harm and how to do that. And so there's a number of different of avenues and different resources that one can use to be of support to that person.
Thank you, Kenyora. Sean has a question regarding Title IX. They're SANE. They work for a government or a grant-funded SANE program on a college campus. And part of their role is to give presentations to the nursing school and other healthcare students, so physicians, assistants. When one of my presentations was over, Sean writes, I had many disclose a sexual assault to me. Some of the assaults happened during their first or second year of high school, and they are now in the second or third year in college. Sean is having an issue because the Title IX department wants us to disclose that everything that students are telling them. They write, our SANE program will disclose anything that happens on campus or from one student or professor toward a student. And here's a question, what type of conversation would you recommend when we will not disclose something that did not occur on campus to the Title IX department?
Wow. Well, first off, Sean, I'm glad that you have students who feel comfortable with coming to you and your colleagues and sharing what their experiences have been. I think the number one type of conversation I think you would have when it and just if I'm hearing this correctly, um, like you want to learn like what not to do, I guess is what I'm hearing. What you'll not disclose. Um, I mean, really, it's if a student's coming to you about their experience that happened in high school, I think the thing you can do for that student is pointing them in the direction of the type of counseling resources that you may have within your campus, as well as any other types of resources that they can avail themselves to. If it's something, a sexual assault experience that happens on your campus that is within your notice, then that's when you would essentially follow the Title IX guidance and do everything you possibly can. Um, I would even say, even in that, even though right now Title IX actually, the way the current Title IX policies are, because they're under the Trump administration, is schools can essentially sweep anything that comes your way in terms of disclosures under the rug, especially if it doesn't even meet the definition of sexual assault or harassment. And so what I would say is, at the very least, do what you can to listen to that student and say, like, what do you need? How can I help you and how can I proceed? And then do with what's within your means as an employee of the campus. But I would even say go above and beyond that of what the Title IX definition is, because that is such a narrow definition that essentially it's one that says it has to be so objectively offensive and pervasive. It's the ands, not the or, but and, that essentially creates a narrow window for anyone to be able to disclose. And so I would even say giving the ownership back to the student themselves to make the decision to report. But this is a tough one because there's also state laws that one would have to think about in terms of that and what you're protected under. But I also want to sit a little bit more concretely with this because this is the first time anyone's ever asked this question. So I'm doing this on the spot, Sean. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, and the state law would kick in, right, for minors, but if they're disclosing and they're in college, then I assume Sean is under this mandatory reporting guideline, and there are faculty and administrators who are pushing back against that. Let's see where it lands in terms of litigation.
Absolutely. That mandated reporting has to be looked at in a completely totally different way. In fact, that's one of the things that we're actually hoping to change, especially within the Title IX guidance.
Along those same lines, but this coming from a question coming from Shirley about abuse of power at institutions. They write, I've seen male professors who have slept with vulnerable female graduate students, even ones they are supervising. The workplace somehow supports this, and these professors all become full professors, and those who complain are held back and marginalized. How does it relate to rape culture on campus, as everyone knows it, but nobody does anything? And is this an abuse of power?
Definitely is an abuse of power, and definitely is, not only does it relate to rape culture, but it's a perpetuation of rape culture. Oftentimes I think when people think about campus sexual assault, they always think about student to student and not necessarily faculty to student or staff to student, or even a student to a professor or a student to a staff member. Anyone is capable of perpetuating rape culture, even if they're not perpetuating the actual sexual assault or harassment itself. Because what we do know to be true is that silence can be is seen as complicit. And so for me, it would be about gathering people that you know who are willing to take a stand, and essentially shout on the rooftops of like what's happening. There are ways in which you can come together as a community, write a letter to your president, go to the media. Hell, we'll help you organize, like, and really, hold your campus their feet to the fire. And we've actually often see that happen a lot of times. In fact, starting in 2020 all the way through now, and it's still happening now, a lot of students have come together of various campuses and have protested to say, enough is enough. Y'all are not doing anything to support us. We're here, we're getting media involved because you need to take into account what's happening and you need to do something about it. And so I would say rally up the troops and mobilize your fellow students and faculty who you trust and other staff members that you trust to really take a stand against your university. It doesn't mean that anyone who has experienced campus sexual assault has to come forward for you to do that. In fact, no one has to share their story in order for you to take a stand. No one has to take a stand, share their story in order for action to happen. And so I think the more folks that who've either experienced this at the hands of their professors or another student, whomever, the more you can say, even if it's one person. And then let me also say that it doesn't have to be a group of people who are experiencing campus sexual assault. It can be one person who's experiencing this, and you're like, we're going to blow everything up. So that's my stance.
Well, and as student advocate Barrett, a student advocate is asking, how do you recommend we approach administrative resistance based on fear of perpetrators suing? It seems this often impairs whatever protection survivors have under Title IX by halting action altogether. How do you suggest we convince administrators to go out on a limb to do as much as they can as allowed, given the 2020 Title IX amendments? And that the context of that is that the Obama administration passed some stronger protections in terms of sexual violence in Title IX. You noted that the Trump administration rolled them back by and large. So what can the student advocate do to get administrators to pay more attention, given the rollbacks and given the pressure from perpetrators to sue?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we actually have connections with a myriad of different legal firms. And so the first thing I would say is definitely reach out to us and we can connect you with them, or you can go directly to them. And that is who I mentioned earlier, like the National Women's Law Center, Equal Rights Advocates, ACLU even, who have folks who they can either connect you with who are legal representatives and attorneys that either provide pro bono or very low cost how do I say this, services, and help you navigate through your options, especially if it's under Title IX or not. And if they're not able to do something, they will also connect you with others. But I would definitely have a conversation with someone who's able to provide just a consultation for you of how to go about that, because what you're dealing with is more of a systemic issue, and where a number of people are trying to essentially put the reputation of the school first before the welfare of their students. And so it goes back to the question previously of, in which I answered, gathering a number of students together to mobilize and take class action. And so happy to connect you with any of those that I had just mentioned.
Great. An anonymous attendee is asking, what are other elements you hope to see included in future iterations of the campus accountability tool?
That is a good question. And there's so many different things that we want to add. But what I want to say is the MAPA tool has always been informed by student survivors and their parents and those in the communities who are trying to shift this culture. And we want to always maintain that integrity and always keep student survivors and advocates as part of the conversation about whatever next iteration the MAPA tool is going to take. We are thinking about what does it look like to create a rating system. We're thinking about ways in which we can implement what would it look like to create a reporting mechanism that is easier and could be standardized to some degree across the board for all schools. And so we're looking at a myriad of different ways that we can use this technology to really serve as a holistic platform, essentially, for students to be able to navigate through not only Title IX, but we also may look into other intersectional laws. We are also thinking about how to incorporate reproductive justice laws, as well as services. As you know, we're currently having Supreme Court make decisions on our bodies, and so wanting to be able to provide anyone, but especially student survivors, with the means and knowledge to access different abortion clinics, what types of, when we talk about sane, nurses and things like that, especially if one is in a rural geographic location and in campus, where's the nearest clinic or hospital that they would want to go to for a forensic exam. So just trying to think of the different things that student survivors are dealing with and what types of services are not just on campus, but also what's off campus. I really want this to be a tool that revolutionizes how we talk about campus sexual assault, especially for high school students who are getting ready to go to college, in their next years, and to help them make an informed decision about how a college addresses campus sexual assault. So yes, it's about what that number one program is or how much a school costs, but also what are they doing to make sure and ensure the safety of their community.
Right. And a rating system would be so helpful, and with parents making that choice, which is a good segue to our last question. An anonymous attendee is asking, are there any resources for parents to prepare their teenagers to navigate hookup and rape culture before heading off to college?
Absolutely. So definitely check out our website at Rape on Campus. But another great resource is Parents Take Action to End Rape on Campus, or PTA EROC. They are not an official affiliate of EROC, but they are a group of parents who, through our support over the years, have come together because they have had children who have experienced campus sexual assaults. And so they come together as a community, whether it's to share resources, share information of how they've navigated through the space. But you can always take a look at ptaeroc.org, and there's a myriad of different resources that they have available for you.
Wonderful. So where can we find you, Kenyora and the EROC?
Definitely EROC at www.nrapeoncampus.org. Our handles across all social media are at nrapeoncampus. And you can follow me at Her Story K on Twitter, Instagram, and of course, LinkedIn. Happy to connect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, instilling your wisdom about what we should be doing both on college campuses and beyond. And thank you so much for your incredible work in this space, especially to make it more inclusive and more effective to serve marginalized, intersectionally marginalized folks. Really appreciate your work. Thank you.
No, thank you, Carolyn. It was an honor to be here. And thank you all so much for your questions. Very good questions.
Great questions. And lots of little kittens, hopefully very soon. Have a great day, y'all.